Alright guys, I'm here to go over some basic watercolor techniques with you before you begin working on your watercolor project. So I've got my paper all laid out with all my different techniques: wet on dry, flat wash, gradient wash, lifting, resist and mask, drop color, water blooms, dry brush, and sgraffito. There's a couple of things that I need to do first to prepare my paper for the different steps or the different techniques. Let's look at resist and mask. That's going to have three sort of different mini techniques on it. The first one being resist. So for the resist, what you're going to use is you can use a white crayon. I'm going to use a white oil pastel. You could also use, actually you can use any kind of waxy material, so even a candle will work with this. And I'm just going to make some lines with my oil pastel, something that's going to be easy to spot once I've got color on top of it. Okay, so I really just made a grid. I know you can't see it, but just make some lines with that oil pastel or their crayon. Okay, the next thing I'm going to use is my, they call it liquid frisket, or sometimes they call it masking fluid. It has a few different names. The brand name of this is Misket. But basically what it is it's actually like liquid rubber. You can also use rubber cement to do this. So this is my Misket, or my masking fluid, and I'm going to take a brush and I'm going to paint an area here. If it's for my painting, it would be an area that I would want to be white. So I'm just going to paint a curly Q on here, and you'll see what this will do later, but this needs time to dry, so I want to make sure I give it that time while I'm working on other areas. Okay, now this brush with the liquid frisket or masking fluid on it, this is, like I said, it's like liquid rubber, so if I let this brush dry, this brush is going to be ruined. So once I'm done doing my masking, I'm going to take my brush and immediately wash it thoroughly, okay, so that it doesn't get ruined, and then clean it off, my paper towel, and it's good to go for the next time I want to use it. Don't use a brand new brush with your masking fluid. There's no reason for it. Try to use a brush that's on its last legs anyway, because chances are it's going to get ruined. Okay, and then lastly, my last masking technique is to take some tape. I'm going to use some masking tape, and I'm just going to tear this into some little strips, maybe some little squares. And tape is another way that you can mask areas of watercolor, just like the tape you use to tape off your walls if you've ever painted a room in your house. You can use masking tape with watercolor or acrylic paint or any kind of paint, really. Okay, and I'll come back to this later, but now it's ready for me when I am ready to start painting. Okay, so let's get started. First technique I'm going to work with is wet on dry. So I've got dry paper, and I'm going to use any color you like to paint, just wet paint on a dry surface. Pardon my phone there. Wet paint on a dry surface. Pretty straightforward. We're actually going to come back to this later. We need this area to dry, but there you have it. Okay? Alright, wet on wet. So what happens now if I start by adding some clean water on my surface? Actually, my water is a little bit dirty, but I'm just laying down water first. Okay? Then what happens if I start to paint on top of it? Let's use orange this time. You can see that the color kind of bleeds out or spreads out on the paper. it doesn't give me those nice crisp edges that my wet on dry did. Now, sometimes you might want that. Sort of depends on what you're painting. Okay, but wet on wet will kind of bleed out. All right. Now, speaking of wet on wet, what if I were to add a color right next to this? Let's use some red. Let's see what happens. What if I paint red right on top of this or right into this? I'm going to give it a second. Watercolor tends to change as it sits longer. You can see the colors are starting to kind of blur together, merge together, where the two colors are mixing thanks to the water. Okay? I can leave it just like this, or I can kind of mix them together myself if I want to get them to fade a little more smoothly. Okay? But wet next to wet is going to produce something similar to this, where you get a fuzzy edge. Okay? And we'll see what happens when we paint wet over dry. We'll come back to this one later. All right. Up next is flat wash. Let's see if we can just get a wash of flat color with as little variation as possible. I'm going to use a nice bright green. In order to get a flat wash, your paint all needs to be wet. Okay, nice flat wash there. Now let's try for a gradient wash. Now if you'll remember, a gradient is very similar when you're working with pencil. It's that fade from dark to light. So let's do this with purple. Okay, so I'm going to start with a lot of paint on my brush, try to get a nice deep color. And then as I move down, I'm going to add some water, more water. So I'm trying to create that soft fade from dark to light. If it's not cooperating with me, which this one is kind of not right now, I can actually try to use gravity to my advantage. So I'll take my paper and I'm going to tilt it and see if I can get that purple to move in the direction that I want it to. There we go. And create that gradient wash. So as it moves down, it's mixing with the water and giving me that nice soft fade, that gradient look. Okay, and as I let this sit, it might change a little more. All right, lifting. Let's talk about lifting. Lifting is super important. Lifting is a way to fix errors, and it's also a way to create any different kinds of effects that you might want. So let's say I'm painting along here and I filled in this whole area with this nice Kelly green. Beautiful. Oh no, wait, I didn't mean to fill that area with green, or this is the wrong green maybe. As long as the paint is still wet, I can take a paper towel and I can dab, pressing down to try to remove some of the paint. If I still have some areas that are being a little bit stubborn, like along this top edge, grab the right brush here. I can wet it again, more water, and then see if I can get more off. Okay, so if you make a mistake, that's a great thing to do. If you just want to create some softness, maybe you're making clouds or something in a nice gray sky, you can kind of lift the color back off again. All right, and you can also lift with a brush. if I take a brush and it's slightly damp, I'm going to dab it on my paintbrush here, or my paper towel, and I'm going to, this is called a thirsty brush. I'm going to kind of use the brush to soak the color back off the paper. After, you'll notice every time I wipe, I clean it off. I don't go back in with any more pigment on my brush than I have to have. Okay, if you have areas like this that are pooling, where they're very dark, you don't want that, take a brush, kind of soak them off until they act the way you want them to. Alright, so that's lifting. It's putting paint down and then taking it back off with something absorbent, like a paper towel or a paintbrush, a thirsty paintbrush. Okay, let's see here. Is my mask ready? This is still a little wet. So let's move on to, we'll work our way this way. Let's work on sgraffito. What does sgraffito mean? Sgraffito means to scratch at the surface of whatever you're working on. So I'm going to take this beautiful blue color, this nice teal blue color, and I'm going to start by painting this area in. So there's two ways you can do this. You fill this in. I'm going to fill it in a little darker. Alright, so if I sgraffito while the paint is still wet, if I scratch at the surface while the paint is still wet, and our metal rulers are a great thing to use for sgraffito. So I'll take the corner of the ruler and I'm just going to scratch at the surface. Let's see what happens. Ooh, excuse me. Tap the table. So you can see that it's creating these darker lines. Okay, and what's happening is the pigment, the color is seeping down into those grooves, those scratches I just make, and making darker lines. Let me zoom in so you can see it a little better. See how the lines get darker when you scratch? Now we're going to let this dry and come back and see what happens when we scratch at the surface when it's dry. All right, dry brush. A dry brush means painting with a dry brush. I'm going to take, I like to do this with round brushes. I'm going to take a brush, okay, and if you look at my paints, I've got little pools, puddles of water sitting in them, and that gets them nice and soft. Okay, so they're easier to dip into. Let's use purple. Let's use this purple. So I've got my brush here and I've got a little too much paint on it, so I'm just going to take it off on my paper towel, and I have very little to no water in my brush, and my paint is also very dry. It's not totally dry, but it's pretty dry. And dry brushing is good, again, to get texture. It's good for fur on animals. So there you go, dry brush. Okay, water blooms. So let's say I put a color down. Let's use this pretty blue here. No, let's use a darker color. I think it'll come out better. Let's use this. We'll use the dark red. Water blooms. So I'm going to start by painting in a shape here. Try to get nice and even and somewhat thin. I find this works best when the color is not too heavy. Okay, now I'm just going to take clean water And I am going to just lightly drop it on the surface. Let me zoom in so you can see this a little better. Just gonna drop it right on that surface. Just plain old clean water. And you can see what the water does is it pushes the pigment out from the center. I can do one more here. You have to give it a second. This is the kind of thing that takes a little bit of patience. But those are water blooms, if you can see them. Okay. All right. Drop color. This is kind of the opposite of a water bloom. I'm going to start with just plain water on my paper. Okay. Now I'm going to drop some color onto it. Let's try black. I haven't done black yet. So what happens if I just do drops of color on the surface of my white or my plain old water? I'm going to zoom in on this one again too so you can see it a little more clearly. Now I have more water down here at the bottom. You can see how it's flowing down because of gravity. So if I have more water there, my drop colors are going to be more washed out. Up here I have less water, so they're a little more intense. Okay, but it's a pretty cool effect, kind of spooky. Okay. All right, we ready to work with the mask yet? I think so. All right, so resist and mask. What happens when I paint over this waxy material I have here on the paper? Again, it could be crayon, it could be oil pastel, it could be, like I said, you could even do this with a candle. But when I paint over it, and I might need to go back a little and just do it a little thinner. That waxy material does not want to accept the paint. And so it leaves it white in those areas. I think I didn't press hard enough on this side. Oh, there it is. Okay, so my little grid I drew on there is resisting the color. It won't stick to those areas. Okay, because it's an oil-based material and then with a water-based on top, and oil and water resist each other. Unfortunately, I cannot go back and change the color where I put this white on here. I can't say, okay, now I want to paint this white area pink. That would not work. Whatever color I've colored it is the color it's going to stay. Now what happens when I go over my masking fluid? I'm going to paint right over that with, I don't think I haven't used this blue. Okay, so I'm just painting right over my masking fluid. Masking fluid is great, like I said, for fine details, highlights on eyeballs. We use it a lot for like reflections on water. Let me just take some of that excess back off again. And we need to let the watercolor dry before we can remove the masking fluid. I'm just painting right over it. Nothing crazy. Okay. And then lastly, my masking tape. Let me make sure it's all pressed down nicely. Give it all a little extra love now. Okay. Let's go over this with, I don't know, I'll use this peachy color here. And let's see what happens when again, I need to let my watercolor dry. I can't take off anything until the watercolor is dry. Okay. So I'm going to let these two dry, and then I will come back to them and remove the masking fluid and remove the tape, see what happens. But we have a couple other things to go back to. Let's look at our wet on dry area. So my pink here is basically dry. I can use the back of my finger, and if when I touch it, it's not cold to the touch, it's just kind of room temperature, or just whatever the temperature of the paper is, then I know that it's dry. So what happens when I go over top of this? I'm going to use this sort of lime green color, and if I do wet on dry, notice what happens. I get nice, clean, sharp edges, okay? I don't want to scrub too much here. Just want to remove any excess. Okay, so you can see, let me zoom in again. You can see that it just looks like two kind of transparent pieces of plastic laying one on top of the other. I can still see the edge of my pink, and I can still see the edge of my green. It's not like this one where they are blending all together in a fade way. One of these is not better than the other, okay? They're just different. Sometimes you might want a hard edge between two colors. And if that's what you want, you have to let one color dry before you put the other one on top of it or next to it. And you have to remember that where you put colors on top of each other, they're going to, there's transparency between the two of them. If you want a nice soft fade between two colors, if you're doing sunsets, maybe, and this one makes me think of fire, that's okay. This is not wrong. The two are just different ways of using the paint. Okay? Okay, so I'm going to give this a few more minutes to dry, and we'll check back and take off these two. Oh, we need to talk about Sgraffito. Let's talk about Sgraffito. So let's go back to my Sgraffito down here at the bottom. Let me scooch this up a smidge. Okay, so I did Sgraffito with it being when the paint was wet, but now what happens when the paint is dry? If I scratch when the paint is dry, let me use my ruler. If I scratch when the paint is dry, I'm essentially tearing the paper. And there might be occasions when this is useful. But now that I've let the paint dry, you can see that this was when the paint was wet, and this is when the paint is dry. When it's dry, I get white marks. When it's wet, I get dark marks. Okay? The color pools when it's wet, and it just sort of sits there and doesn't get into my grooves when it's dry. Okay? All right. So let's let this dry a few more minutes. We'll come back and I'll show you what happens when I remove my resists. All right, guys, we're back, and I'm just going to peel off my my tape and my masking fluid and see what happens. I think you can probably guess what happens. So where my tape was, I was able to create these different shapes. So you could cut the tape to be whatever shape you like, whatever shape you need to mask off areas. So that's with the tape, and that's pretty much, I'm sure you pretty much expected that. But the masking fluid, let's do the masking fluid. So masking fluid can be removed with an eraser. Okay, you really want to use a clean eraser to do this. You don't want to mess up your watercolor. And you don't want to press very hard. Okay, it's more about going over it many times than it is about pressing hard. Once I kind of get it started, I can actually start to peel it off with my fingers. And you have to make sure to do this while the watercolor is dry, not while it's wet. If you do it when it's wet, it's probably going to ruin it. And you can see that wherever I painted the masking fluid and peeled it back off, it's leaving it this nice, clean, sharp white. So masking fluid is a pretty cool material. Let me get up close so you can see how that looks. There you go. So this was our crayon, masking fluid, masking tape. Alright, now here's the thing about masking fluid. It's not the cheapest. So if you need to mask off large areas, you want to use masking tape. If you need to mask off small, intricate details, you want to use masking fluid. Okay, you don't use masking fluid in large areas. So there you go. Those are your basic techniques. Hope that was helpful. Give them all a try. Replay and follow along as you need to. And have fun with watercolor.